Manhattan, New York, sparkles with its grand architecture and towering skyscrapers, always bustling with the rush of modern life. The city is a fusion of lights and sounds, where business never stops, and the relentless pursuit of success dictates the rhythm of every resident. At the top of this scene, in a world far removed from the reality of most, lives Richard Blake, one of the city's most powerful businessmen. His apartment on the Upper East Side, a luxurious penthouse with glass walls offering a privileged view of Central Park, is a masterpiece of modernity and minimalist style. Within this space of silence and wealth, Richard moves with a cold efficiency, as if his life were a direct reflection of the impeccable organization of his surroundings. Every piece of furniture, every object seems chosen to serve a functional purpose, with no room for sentimentality or nostalgia. The city's glow reflects off the chrome surfaces of the open kitchen, where no one cooks. He rarely has time to stop, to truly live. His mind, occupied with meetings, corporate mergers, and multi-million-dollar projects, refuses to be affected by memories of the past. Yet, deep down in his heart, something pulses quietly, an emptiness he can't seem to fill, no matter how many successes he accumulates. The muffled sounds of Manhattan below barely penetrate the windows of his apartment. When Richard stops to observe the city, he sees only more business opportunities, more goals to be achieved. The only personal space in his life is his private gym, where he keeps up a workout routine to stay mentally and physically sharp. Personal life for him is a practically extinct concept. Relationships, the few he dared to maintain since his meteoric rise in business, never lasted more than a few months. Work is what defines him, and he's convinced it's what brought him here, to the top of the world. At least that's what he keeps telling himself. Meanwhile, in a neighborhood far removed from Richard's life of luxury, Emily Carter lives an opposite reality in the Bronx. The apartment she shares with her 10-year-old son, Jake, is modest but cozy. The walls are decorated with colorful drawings made by Jake, bringing life to a space that would otherwise be just another forgotten corner in the middle of the city. The kitchen, unlike Richard's, is always full of activity. Pots boiling, the aroma of spices, and the sound of dishes clattering on the counter as Emily prepares dinner after another long day of work. She works at one of Manhattan's most upscale restaurants, where the customers are wealthy and demanding, but her salary barely covers the bills. For Emily, each day is a struggle to keep the bills paid, to ensure Jake has what he needs. Since Jake's birth, she has learned to be strong. Life taught her not to expect much from people, especially after what happened with Richard, the man she once loved deeply. Back then, she believed he loved her too. But the reality of their different priorities and the worlds that separated them eventually won out. When he left for New York in pursuit of success, never knowing she was carrying his child, Emily decided she would protect Jake from that distant and cruel world. Jake, for his part, is a boy full of life and energy. His eyes always shine with curiosity, even as he darts through the city's traffic lights, selling small flowers to help his mother. Despite his age, he understands the difficulties his mother faces and wants, in some way, to lighten her burden. Unbeknownst to Emily, he wanders the streets of Manhattan, trying to earn some money to surprise her, never imagining that one day his path would lead him face to face with the father he never knew. The city thus becomes the backdrop for these two very different lives. Richard, lost in his glass tower, living the life of a successful man but empty inside. Emily, struggling in the suburbs, surrounded by hardship but sustained by the love she has for Jake. And Jake, an unconscious bridge between these two worlds, about to change his parents' lives forever. Manhattan, with all its grandeur, seems small compared to the emotions about to be awakened. Richard Blake never imagined he'd reach where he is now. As a young man, his dreams were big, but always seemed far from the small town in rural Texas where he grew up. The son of a mechanic and a housewife, he learned early the value of hard work. But destiny wanted him elsewhere, a higher destiny he believed he could only reach with effort and total focus on his goals. And that's exactly what he did. Now, at 38, Richard is one of the most successful businessmen in the tech industry. He's built a fortune that most can only dream of. His company, a giant in enterprise software, is valued at billions of dollars. In New York, his name is respected and feared. In the business world, Richard became known as a ruthless man, capable of making tough decisions without hesitation. He always tells himself that it was this determination that brought him to the top. But deep down, he knows there was a price. There were sacrifices, people left behind, feelings he buried, believing they would never resurface. In rare moments of silence, when the city outside slows down for a few moments, Richard's mind drifts back to Texas, to a life he abandoned. It wasn't just a town he left behind, but also a piece of his heart. Emily Carter was his great love. They met when they were young, at a time when the world seemed full of possibilities, but also uncertainties. She was the opposite of Richard in many ways. Simple, caring, with a natural joy for life that enchanted everyone around her. But it was precisely that joy that first attracted Richard. With her, he felt he could have more than just professional success. He felt complete. However, Richard's ambition was always strong. With the growing pressure of his career and the promise of a better life in New York, he did what he thought was necessary. The farewell was bitter, full of misunderstandings and unspoken words. He left without knowing that he was leaving Emily with a secret that would change her life forever. The pain of that separation followed him in his early years in New York, but the fast pace of his rise in business eventually helped him suppress those memories. Now, 15 years later, Richard is at the peak of his career. But despite his success, the emptiness persists. He has everything: money, status, power. But the feeling that something is missing never completely leaves him. Sometimes he wonders what would have happened if he had stayed in Texas, if he had fought harder for Emily's love. But he quickly dismisses those thoughts, believing it's too late to go back. His life is in New York now, and the past, to him, is something that can't be changed. Despite his calm and cold exterior, behind his facade of absolute control, Richard hides a growing anxiety. In recent months, he's begun to feel that his life, no matter how perfect it seems, is becoming mechanical, without purpose. The emotional void gnaws at him more and more. He tries to fill that emptiness with more work, endless meetings, and expensive dinners with people who mean very little to him. His relationships are, at best, superficial. He's never managed to keep anyone close for long. The coldness he developed over the years to handle business challenges has also seeped into his personal life. He has everything money can buy, but he's missing what he valued most when he was young. Genuine love, the feeling of being truly connected to someone. That old photo of Emily, tucked away in a drawer in his penthouse office, was never thrown away. In rare moments of introspection, Richard allows himself to look at it, remembering what once was and what he let slip away. But those moments are fleeting. He always shuts the drawer right after, as if closing it could also lock away the feelings he's still unable to process. Then comes the unexpected encounter at the traffic light. That morning, late for an important meeting with investors, Richard nearly overlooks the boy selling flowers at the intersection. But something about the way the boy carries himself makes him stop. Jake has an energy that somehow feels familiar. His bright, lively eyes catch Richard's attention. Richard rolls down the car window to speak to the boy, who quickly approaches with a captivating smile. "Hi, sir. Want to buy some flowers?" Jake asks enthusiastically, his face lit up despite the cold afternoon. He holds out a small bouquet, with some fresh flowers and others slightly wilted. Richard watches for a moment, intrigued by the boy's confidence. Something about Jake stirs a distant memory that Richard can't quite place. "How much?" Richard asks directly, though his curiosity is growing. $10 for this bouquet," Jake replies, excited, his eyes fixed on the man in the car. "You know, my mom taught me how to make these. She's great in the kitchen and with flowers too." The mention of Jake's mother makes Richard smile slightly. He reaches out, taking the bouquet, but something in Jake's tone makes him ask, "What's your mother's name?" Jake, always happy to talk about his mom, replies proudly, "Emily. She works at a famous restaurant here. One day I'm going to open my own, just like her." The enthusiasm in his voice is contagious. Richard freezes for a moment. Emily. The name strikes him like lightning, but he quickly dismisses the thought. Emily is a common name after all. Even so, the sound of it lingers in his mind as he pulls out his wallet and hands Jake a $20 bill. "Keep the change," Richard says, studying the boy's eyes again, trying to decipher what he's feeling. Jake, surprised and grateful, beams even more. "Wow, thanks, sir. One day I'll sell you real flowers, not these ones from the street." Richard chuckles softly, unable to fully understand what this brief exchange is awakening in him. "I'll be waiting for that day, kid," Richard replies before rolling up the window and driving off, watching Jake in the rearview mirror. The boy runs to another car, full of energy, unaware that he's just changed his father's life forever. The thoughts of the boy stay with Richard for the rest of the day. There's something in Jake's eyes that haunts him, as if that encounter, no matter how casual, had a deeper meaning. He doesn't know it yet, but that meeting at the traffic light is just the beginning of a series of events that will shake the foundations of his meticulously built life. Days pass since Richard's encounter with the boy at the light, but the image of the boy, and especially the name Emily, continue to echo in his mind. He wonders if that simple exchange of words was just a coincidence, or if destiny is trying to send him a message. But as usual, he tries to shift his thoughts back to work, convincing himself it's just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, New York is a big city, and the chances of that boy being his Emily's son are infinitesimal. Life has moved on for both of them, he believes. However, fate seems to have other plans. On a Friday night, Richard decides to dine out to unwind after a long work week. He rarely has time for such moments of relaxation, but something bothers him that day, a feeling of restlessness he can't shake. Without thinking too much, he picks one of the city's most renowned restaurants, known for both its sophistication and impeccable cuisine. Upon arriving, the ambiance is exactly as he imagined: elegant, minimalist, and full of influential people. It's the kind of place he frequents out of habit, not pleasure. The hostess leads him to a secluded table by the window, where he can see the city lights twinkling in the distance. The restaurant is busy, but the sound of conversations around him is muted, creating an air of exclusivity. He orders an expensive wine and begins to browse the menu, unaware that this dinner will change his life. While Richard studies the list of dishes, in the kitchen, Emily Carter is racing against time. She's in the middle of the dinner rush, coordinating the plates with precision. The routine is exhausting, but the work keeps her focused, away from the problems she faces at home and her worries about Jake. She's learned to handle the pressure of the restaurant, and her reputation as one of the best chefs on the team is only growing. Emily rarely steps out into the dining room. She prefers to stay in the background, away from the curious gazes of the wealthy clientele. But that night, the manager is overwhelmed, and one of the servers asks for help delivering a dish to a table. She hesitates, not wanting to expose herself, but agrees, thinking it will be quick and painless. As she steps out of the kitchen and walks toward the table, Emily keeps her head down, focused on the dish she's carrying. But when she finally looks up, time seems to stop. Sitting before her, absorbed in the menu, is Richard Blake, the man she once loved, the man who left without knowing she was carrying his child. Emily freezes, her heart racing. The shock is overwhelming, and for a moment, she feels like that 21-year-old again, full of uncertainty and unresolved pain. The memories she had spent years trying to bury flood back, threatening to consume her. Her hands tremble, and she nearly drops the plate. Richard, unaware of the emotional storm he's just caused, looks up to thank her for the dish, as he would with any other employee. But when his eyes meet Emily's, everything changes. At first, he doesn't believe what he's seeing. His eyes narrow, as if his mind is trying to decipher a mirage. Emily, the Emily. Of all the people and places, there she is standing before him. The air seems to leave the room for a second, and Richard is left speechless. The years melt away in an instant, and all the emotions he thought he had buried come rushing back. Emily? His voice is hoarse, incredulous, as if saying her name out loud for the first time in years. Emily takes a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. The initial shock is crushing, but she can't afford to lose control. Not here, not in front of Richard, and certainly not in the middle of the restaurant where she works. Richard, she responds, almost in a whisper, as if his name were an old wound that never fully healed. For a few seconds, time truly seems to stand still. The noise around them fades into the background, and in that moment, it's just the two of them, staring at each other, both grappling with a flood of emotions. Richard rises slowly, still stunned, as the reality of seeing Emily in the flesh sinks in like a wave crashing over him. He never imagined he'd see her again, much less under these circumstances. The successful man, accustomed to having control over everything around him, now feels vulnerable and disarmed in front of the woman he once loved and left behind. Richard tries to speak, but the words escape him. What could he possibly say after all these years? Emily feels the tension building in her chest. She knew that eventually she might run into Richard somewhere in New York, but she never imagined it would be like this. So sudden and unexpected. And above all, he has no idea that he has a son. That truth, still buried deep within her heart, holds her back from moving. Before she can respond, the restaurant manager appears, breaking the moment with urgent business. "Emily, we need you in the kitchen now," he says, pulling her back to reality. Emily nods, still avoiding direct eye contact with Richard. The pressure in her chest builds as she tries to keep herself together. I have to go," she says quickly before turning and disappearing back into the kitchen, leaving Richard standing in the middle of the dining room, confused and deeply shaken. Back in the kitchen, Emily rests her hands on the counter, taking deep breaths. Her heart is still pounding, and the emotions are bubbling up inside her. She knows that sooner or later, Richard will seek her out again. And when that happens, there will be no avoiding the questions she's been dodging for so long. Across the restaurant, Richard sits back down, still in shock. The sudden encounter with Emily has stirred up a whirlwind of emotions and doubts. He needs to talk to her. He needs to understand what happened in the last 10 years and, most importantly, why she disappeared from his life so abruptly. In the days following the unexpected reunion at the restaurant, Richard can't get Emily out of his mind. The impact of seeing her after all these years, the shock of realizing she's in the same city, living a reality so far from his, leaves him restless. Her name echoes in his thoughts, bringing back feelings he thought he had buried. The image of Emily, the same woman he had fallen in love with, but now more mature, stronger, perhaps even more wounded, haunts him. For the first time in a long while, Richard finds himself distracted at work. His meetings don't have the same focus as usual, and his mind drifts between the present and memories of the past. What brought her to New York? What happened to her after he left? Why did she never reach out? These questions spin in Richard's head, but he hesitates to take action. Part of him wants to believe that their encounter was just a coincidence, that perhaps it's better to leave the past where it belongs. After all, they've both moved on in their own ways. And deep down, Richard fears discovering something that could further complicate his already controlled life. For years, he built emotional barriers to protect himself from pain and uncertainty, and now he feels those walls being tested. But there's another part of him, stronger, more emotional, that knows he has to see Emily again. He needs answers. He needs to understand why she never sought him out. And maybe on some level, he wants to know if there's still a spark of that old love. Yet Richard wrestles with the dilemma. Should he re-enter Emily's life, knowing it could reopen old wounds? Meanwhile, Emily is just as shaken by the reunion. Since that night at the restaurant, it feels like a storm is approaching. Richard's face, more mature and still imposing, haunts her thoughts. She tries to push the image away, telling herself that their lives have gone in different directions, that they no longer belong to the same world. But it's impossible to deny the connection she still feels, a mix of pain and nostalgia, but also something unfinished. Emily fears that Richard will start looking for her. She's terrified that he'll discover the truth about Jake, a truth she's kept hidden for so many years. She protected her son from what she considered an incompatible lifestyle, believing that Richard, with his drive for success and ambition, wouldn't be able to be a present father. She was afraid that if he knew about Jake, he might want to take him into his world, a world of wealth, but also of loneliness. Now, however, she can no longer run from reality. Emily knows Richard saw her, and his look said it all. He wouldn't let her disappear so easily this time. But how could she confront that past while still protecting the present she's built for herself and Jake? The dilemma is overwhelming, and she feels like she's standing at a crossroads. On the other side of the city, in the cold, minimalist surroundings of his apartment, Richard finally makes a decision. He can't simply ignore what happened. The image of Emily and the boy at the traffic light haunts him, and a part of his mind starts to piece things together, though he hasn't yet fully realized what it all means. He convinces himself that he needs to confront her, but not just to understand what happened. He needs an explanation. Something inside him is awakening, a deep desire to resolve what was left unfinished between them. A thought crosses his mind. What if Emily has something to hide? He remembers the boy at the traffic light, his name, and how the boy spoke so proudly of his mother. The coincidences begin to pile up, and an instinct, or maybe something more emotional, starts to surface. Could that boy be connected to him? Could he be his son? Richard doesn't want to jump to conclusions, but the doubt is now an open wound he can't ignore. Meanwhile, at home in the Bronx, Emily watches Jake playing in their small apartment. He is everything to her, her greatest pride, her greatest joy. But he's also the unbreakable bond between her and Richard, something she can no longer deny. She had always believed she was protecting Jake by not telling him the truth. But with the reunion, that choice now weighs heavier than ever. She begins to question, was it wrong to keep him away from his father? What if Richard deserves to know he has a son? Emily looks at Jake, who's sitting on the floor drawing with his colored pencils, and feels a wave of concern. What would Richard do if he found out the truth? Would he try to take Jake away from her? Could he even be prepared to be a father after so many years devoted exclusively to his career? The dilemma torments Emily night after night. She knows the truth may come out one way or another, but she's not ready to face that confrontation. Every time she thinks of Richard, her heart races, and the memories of what they shared in the past resurface, mingling with the fear of what he represents in the present. Richard, for his part, takes an action he can no longer avoid. He decides to return to the restaurant, but this time, not as a casual customer. He wants answers. When he arrives at the restaurant again, the tension in his chest is palpable. The sophisticated atmosphere around him isn't enough to distract his thoughts. He knows what he wants. He wants to talk to Emily, and this time she won't be able to run away. The hostess recognizes him from his previous visit and leads him to the same table, but Richard is impatient. He watches every movement in the restaurant, waiting for Emily to appear. Finally, she appears in the hall, taking another order to a nearby table. Their eyes meet again, and the tension between them is undeniable. This time Richard doesn't wait. He stands up and walks toward her, ignoring the curious glances around him. Emily, for a moment, is frozen, knowing there's no way to avoid the confrontation anymore. "We need to talk, Emily," he says, his voice firm but not without emotion. She sighs deeply, feeling the weight of his words. She knew this moment would come. "Not here," Emily replies, her voice trembling slightly. I'll be out soon. Wait for me outside." Richard nods, respecting her request. He returns to the table, but his heart is racing. The dilemma has now reached its climax, and he knows that what comes next could change everything. For him, for Emily, and maybe for the boy he saw at the stoplight. Emily goes back into the kitchen, her heart heavy. The truth is about to come out, and she knows the conversation to follow will define all their futures. The New York night enveloped Richard in a freezing shroud as he waited. Leaning against the restaurant's wall, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. The cold, biting wind seemed insignificant compared to the storm brewing in his mind. He still didn't know exactly what he wanted to say to Emily, or even what he hoped to hear. The only thing he knew was that he needed answers. The silence around him was thick with uncertainty and old memories that insisted on resurfacing. When Emily finally came out through the restaurant's side door, Richard's heart quickened. He watched as she approached slowly, her body hunched under a simple coat. Her face, illuminated by the soft streetlights, was tense, reflecting a mix of determination and nerves. Richard knew that what was coming next wouldn't be easy for either of them. She stopped in front of him, the tension between them palpable, the silence cutting. For a moment, neither knew where to begin. There was so much to say, but the words felt stuck, too heavy to be spoken under the cold city lights. Both felt the weight of the past on their shoulders, and any attempt to break that silence would be like reopening an old wound, still painful. Richard was the first to speak, his voice low and hesitant. "Thank you for coming, Emily," he said, his words coming out with an unusual caution. He had always been straightforward in business, but with her, his words had to be measured, as if their impact could be greater than expected. I know this is strange, but we need to talk. We can't pretend like nothing happened." Emily crossed her arms, her body tense, and took a deep breath. With every passing second, she felt the weight of the situation grow heavier. Richard's proximity brought emotions to the surface that she had long tried to bury. She kept her eyes on the ground for a few seconds before finally looking up to face him. "I don't know what you want, Richard," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's been so long. What's left to say now?" Richard felt a tightness in his chest when he heard Emily's voice, laden with pain and distance. He knew that time had passed for both of them, but he couldn't shake the need to understand, to know why she disappeared, why she never reached out again. Yes, he had left, but he always wondered if the love they had could have survived if things had been different. "I know it's been a long time," he began, taking a step toward her, as if to close the emotional distance. "But when I saw you, something changed. I can't stop thinking about why you disappeared, why you never reached out, Emily." Richard's voice wavered slightly, filled with a vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. Emily felt her heart tighten, a lump forming in her throat. She never wanted to relive that part of her life. Every day she fought to leave behind the hurt and shattered dreams, but now here was Richard, digging it all up at once. "I left because you left first," she replied, her voice gaining strength as the pain from the past resurfaced. "You were so focused on building your career, on becoming the successful man you always wanted to be, that there wasn't any room left for us. For me, I couldn't stay and watch you drift away, knowing that in the end, I'd just be another memory from your past." Richard shook his head, feeling the weight of her words hit him hard. He knew he had been ambitious, knew he had left important people behind in his pursuit of success, but hearing it from Emily, the woman he had loved so much, made it all feel painfully real. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his words heavy with regret. "I thought that by building a better life I was doing the right thing. I thought that if I got what I wanted we could—" He stopped, hesitating, knowing that whatever he said now wouldn't fix the past. Emily looked away, a silent pain showing on her face. As much as she knew the Richard standing in front of her might be feeling remorse, she couldn't erase what had happened. She couldn't simply forget the nights spent crying and the fear she felt when she found out she was pregnant, alone. But there was something else, something Richard still didn't know, and that she was afraid to reveal. "I moved on, Richard," she said, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. "It wasn't easy, but I moved on. I had to, for myself, and for Jake." The name Jake made Richard freeze. He frowned, clearly confused, and asked, "Jake?" Emily swallowed hard, knowing she had opened a door she couldn't close. She hadn't meant to mention her son's name, but in that moment, emotions were spinning out of control. "My son," she said, almost in a whisper. "Jake is my son, Richard." Richard felt a wave of confused emotions surge inside him. A son? Emily had a son? He felt completely disoriented. The pieces began to move in his mind, but they still didn't fully fit together. "Your son," he repeated, trying to process the information. How old is he?" Emily hesitated for a second before answering, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. 10 years. 10 years. Richard felt the ground fall out from under him. The boy at the stoplight, the kid he had seen selling flowers, couldn't be just a coincidence. The image of that boy came into his mind with sudden clarity. The eyes, the confident posture, the energy he hadn't been able to ignore. Something inside him began to stir, a sense that something was about to be revealed, but he still couldn't piece it all together. "You said 10 years, Richard murmured, still processing, the shock evident on his face. Was he there that day? The boy selling flowers?" Emily closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the truth. She knew this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of what was about to happen. She took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, Jake was there. He was selling flowers, trying to help with the bills. Her voice faltered as she mentioned the reason, shame, and pride intertwined. Richard felt a mix of disbelief and anger boil inside him. His son was selling flowers on the street while he, the father, lived surrounded by luxury and excess. And he hadn't known. He hadn't known anything. "Why?" he began, but the anger and shock made him choke on his words. "Why didn't you ever tell me, Emily? Why did you hide this from me?" Emily felt the tears start to rise but fought to stay strong. She knew Richard was hurting, but she also knew the choices she made weren't simple. I did what I thought was right," she said, her voice breaking. "When I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. You were building your empire in New York, and I knew deep down you weren't ready to be a father. And I couldn't bring Jake into a life where you'd always be distant, focused on other things." Richard was silent, conflicting emotions exploding inside him. Yes, he was angry, but he was also devastated by the sense of loss. He had a son and didn't know. A 10-year-old boy who lived his life without knowing who his father was. "You took that from me," he whispered, the pain clear in every word. "You took away my chance to be a father. I lost all those years, and I didn't even know." Emily let the tears fall, unable to keep up the facade any longer. "I just wanted to protect Jake," she said, her voice weak, "and in a way, protect you too." Richard felt a mixture of anger and sadness consuming him. He knew his life would never be the same. Now he had a son he would have to meet, care for, and somehow win back. The revelation that Richard was Jake's father was still etched in his mind like a fresh wound. During the entire ride back to his luxurious Manhattan apartment, he couldn't shake off the thoughts of the new reality that had just been thrust upon him. The idea that he had a 10-year-old son living on the streets, struggling to help his mother, tormented him deeply. The weight of guilt was crushing. He thought of all the times he had passed by children on the streets, never once imagining that one of them could be his own. As he entered his penthouse, the oppressive silence filled the cold, minimalist space, and Richard felt a void that had never hit him so strongly before. He had everything, a huge home, cars, a multi-million-dollar company, but he was missing the most important thing. A son he didn't even know existed, and a woman he had loved and left behind. He couldn't sleep that night. His mind buzzed with unanswered questions. What would Jake be like? Could he handle being a father? How would Emily react to a stronger approach? But above all, was it too late to fix things? The next morning, Richard made his first tough decision. He needed to find a way to approach Jake without coming off as invasive or forced. Emily had made it clear that she was protecting him, that she feared how Richard's lifestyle might affect the boy. And maybe she was right. After all this time, he didn't even know where to start. He was used to solving problems with negotiations, contracts, and strategies, But dealing with family emotions was something beyond his control. Determined to take the first step, he began researching Jake's life. He knew where Emily lived, and it didn't take long to discover that Jake attended a public school in the Bronx, not far from where they lived. It was a world very different from what Richard could offer, and he couldn't help but wonder how his son lived in that small apartment, facing challenges Richard had never experienced. One afternoon, Richard drove to the school, planning only to watch from afar. He parked his car across the street and saw the kids pouring out of the school, running with heavy backpacks and carefree smiles. Among the group, he saw him, Jake. The boy was energetic, talkative, and full of life. His laughter was clear, and he seemed popular among his friends. Richard felt a mix of relief and pain seeing the boy he never knew, but somehow already admired. He watched for a while, unsure of how to approach. Should he just go up to him, tell him who he was? No, that would be too intrusive. He wanted to do things right, but the uncertainty of how to act left him frozen. As someone who always had control over everything, Richard felt lost in the simplicity of such a complex emotional situation. As he stood there, lost in thought, he saw something that made him freeze. Jake was talking to an older man, a guy who looked like he was selling something on the streets, and after a few minutes the man shoved Jake. The boy fell to the ground, and without thinking, Richard bolted out of the car, his blood boiling with anger and protectiveness. He rushed over, his fatherly instinct guiding him without a second thought. "Hey!" Richard shouted with natural authority as he approached the man who had pushed Jake. "What do you think you're doing? Stay away from him." The man, startled by Richard's sudden intervention, stepped back, muttering some excuse before disappearing into the crowd. Jake, still on the ground, looked up at Richard with wide eyes, not understanding who this stranger was that had just defended him. There was confusion and surprise in the boy's gaze. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, his voice still trembling with adrenaline as he helped Jake to his feet. He held him by the shoulders, trying to seem calm, but his heart was racing. He was standing before his son, and the moment felt unreal. Jake nodded, a bit dazed. "I'm fine, thanks, sir," the boy replied, brushing off his dirty pants. His wary eyes studied Richard, as if trying to figure out why a complete stranger had stepped in like that. Richard opened his mouth to say more, maybe to try to start a casual conversation, but the words failed him. All he wanted to say was, "I'm your father," but he knew that wouldn't be fair to Jake. The boy had his life, his own struggles, and Richard was still a complete stranger to him. "Be careful, okay?" Richard said, his voice sounding oddly soft for someone used to giving orders and controlling everything around him. Jake nodded again, still confused, and quickly walked away, glancing back one last time before disappearing with one of his friends. Richard watched as the boy vanished into the crowd of students. His chance to approach had slipped away at that moment, but he knew this was just the beginning. He couldn't force his way into Jake's life. That would be devastating for both him and Emily. However, that simple incident was enough for Richard to realize something important. He didn't know how to be a father. He had never dealt with anything like this. It was as if he was on a dark road without a map or compass, with only a vague hope that he was heading in the right direction. In the days that followed, he tried to figure out a way to approach Emily again. She was right to worry about how his sudden presence might impact Jake's life. But how could he regain Emily's trust? How could he prove that he was willing to be part of their lives without destroying what they had built? An even greater obstacle loomed. Jake didn't know who he was. And for Richard, trying to build a relationship without revealing the truth was impossible. The fear of how Jake would react consumed him. What if the boy rejected him? What if Jake never accepted him as his father? Still, Richard knew that no matter how hard it was, he couldn't give up. He wanted, and needed, to be a part of Jake's life. But the first thing he had to do was face Emily. She was still the key to everything. She needed to trust him, and he needed to show her that he wasn't just there out of guilt or remorse. He wanted to be the father he never was. Emily, on the other hand, was fighting her own internal battle. She knew Richard was starting to show up more in her and Jake's lives. She knew he was watching, trying to get closer, but she wasn't ready to open that door yet. The fear that he might hurt her son, emotionally or even unintentionally, kept her guarded. The past between her and Richard was far too complicated, full of pain and regret. And now, her and Jake's lives were at stake. In the days after the unexpected encounter with Jake at school, Richard realized he was facing a much bigger challenge than any business negotiation or financial crisis he had ever handled. Fatherhood, especially the way he had been thrust into it, was uncharted territory, full of uncertainties, raw emotions, and deep fears. He knew he wanted to be part of Jake's life, But how could he approach a boy who had no idea who he was without scaring him? Or worse, pushing him further away. After reflecting on what to do, Richard decided he needed help. There was something he understood very well. You can't face a complex challenge without allies, and in this case, he couldn't rely on his business instincts alone. He needed someone who understood what he was going through and who could guide him on how to build a relationship with Jake. His first attempt was to turn to someone unexpected. Evelyn, his personal assistant. Evelyn had worked with him for years, always efficient and discreet, handling all the complications that arose in his professional life. She was one of the few people who knew his true nature beyond the cold businessman. He hesitated to talk to her, but he knew that if there was anyone he could trust in this delicate moment, it was Evelyn. One morning after a meeting, Richard called her into his office. When she entered, he seemed distracted, looking out the window with the Manhattan skyline in the background. Evelyn knew something was bothering him. She knew his habits and expressions with the precision of someone who had spent years observing him. "I need to talk to you about something personal," he said bluntly. Something rare for Richard. He always kept his personal life separate from his business. Evelyn sat down in front of him, waiting, while Richard carefully chose his words. He began, then took a deep breath, looking at his assistant with sincerity. "I recently found out that I have a son, a 10-year-old boy." Evelyn blinked, surprised, but maintained her calm composure. She had seen many twists and turns in the business world, but this was undoubtedly the most personal thing Richard had ever confided in her. "A son?" she asked, leaning slightly forward without judgment, just trying to understand what this meant for him. "Yes," Richard continued, running his hands through his hair, visibly uncomfortable. "His mother is someone from my past, Emily. We had a history many years ago before I moved to New York, and I never knew she was pregnant." He paused for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if trying to process everything again. "She never told me. I just found out recently, and now I don't know how to deal with it." Evelyn looked at him with empathy. She knew Richard was a man of control, of logic, of certainties, and this situation was deeply affecting his ability to handle things pragmatically. "How do you want to deal with it?" she asked softly, giving him space to process his emotions. Richard was silent for a moment, pondering. "I want to be part of his life," he finally admitted, his voice filled with a raw sincerity he rarely showed. "But Emily, she's hesitant, and Jake doesn't know who I am. I don't know how to approach him without seeming like an intruder. I don't know how to be a father." Evelyn nodded, understanding how crucial this moment was for Richard. "That's very complicated, but I think the first step is to earn Emily's trust," she said, direct but gentle. "If she's still wary, it's probably because she wants to protect her son. If you can show her that you're committed, not just to being a father, but to being part of their lives in a respectful and responsible way, things might start to change." Richard knew Evelyn was right. He needed to prove to Emily that he was willing to change, that he was no longer the work-obsessed man distant from his past. "But how do I do that?" Richard asked, for the first time admitting his vulnerability. He was used to having all the answers, but now he found himself lost. Evelyn thought for a moment, and then suggested something that surprised Richard. "Maybe you need more than just words. Maybe you need to show her that you're willing to act. Do you know the challenges she faces with Jake? Their life in the Bronx? Maybe it's time to offer help in a way that shows you really care, without trying to take control of the situation." Those words resonated with Richard. For years, he had been so focused on his own life that he had never considered how his absence might have shaped Emily and Jake's lives. Now he realized he couldn't just come in and say he wanted to be a father. He needed to prove he was willing to be part of their reality, with all its difficulties and complexities. The conversation with Evelyn was a turning point. For the first time, Richard felt like he had a plan, but he still needed more support. He decided to reach out to Paul, an old friend and fellow businessman who had gone through a similar situation, but a long time ago. Paul had been a successful young entrepreneur who, after a complicated divorce, had struggled to rebuild his relationship with his teenage son. They had always talked about business, but Paul was one of the few people with whom Richard shared more personal aspects of his life. Richard invited Paul for a private dinner, knowing he would need his perspective. "So, you want to know how to suddenly be a dad?" Paul asked with a tired smile as Richard explained his situation. "Basically," Richard replied, not trying to hide his frustration. "I know it's a huge task, but I need advice. You've been through this. How do I get close to Jake without scaring him off or imposing too much?" Paul thought for a moment, his expression turning serious. "It won't be easy, man. At first, you're going to want to make up for everything you missed, but you can't rush things. You've got to earn his trust, little by little. Not as the absent dad who's back, but as someone who genuinely wants to get to know him. And above all, you have to be ready to accept whatever he feels. He might reject you at first, or he might accept you, but you can't control him like you do your business. Those words made Richard reflect deeply. For the first time, he realized that winning Jake's love and trust wasn't something he could guarantee with quick actions or grand gestures. He would have to enter Jake's life with humility, patience, and respect for the space that the boy and Emily had created. The journey wouldn't just be about repairing the past, but about learning to be vulnerable in a role he had never played before. After long talks with Paul and Evelyn, Richard started to grasp what he needed to do. He would have to build the relationship step by step, without forcing the process. Jake needed time to accept his presence in his life, and Emily needed to trust that Richard was there to stay and wouldn't run away again when things got tough. Richard looked out at the city lights from his apartment, his mind racing with thoughts he could barely organize. The loneliness of the penthouse had never felt so oppressive. Manhattan, with its lights and towering buildings, offered no solace for the emotional whirlwind consuming him. In the life he had built with such effort, surrounded by success and wealth, he felt more powerless than ever. The silence was suffocating. The truth was, no matter how much he had talked with Evelyn and Paul, no matter how much he tried to plan, nothing had prepared him for the reality of being Jake's father. Father. The word echoed in his mind with a weight he still didn't know how to carry. He had spent so many years focused on his career, on tangible achievements and results, that he found himself incapable of handling something as abstract and unpredictable as human emotion. Deep down, he feared he wouldn't be able to be the father Jake needed. Would he have the patience? Would he know how to guide him, how to help him through difficulties? All of it was new and terrifying, like Richard was navigating unknown waters without a map. And more than anything, the fear of failure was crushing. In his professional life, he controlled everything. He knew how to manage crises, how to deal with aggressive competitors, how to turn threats into opportunities. But with Jake, there were no guarantees. The boy was a mystery to him, a son he should know intimately, yet was completely distant from. And to make things worse, Jake didn't even know the truth. Richard found himself imagining the moment when Jake would finally learn that he was his father. How would he react? Would he be angry for all those years of absence? Or would he accept Richard in his life? These questions haunted him. The wary look Jake had given him when he helped him that afternoon, the way the boy seemed distant yet full of energy, was something Richard couldn't forget. More and more, he found himself trapped in a cycle of negative thoughts, where the answers his mind created were always the worst possible. And then there was Emily. His feelings for her were still alive, no matter how hard he tried to push them away. When he saw her for the first time at the restaurant, it was as if time had stopped. The impact of seeing her after so many years brought up a pain he thought he had buried. Now, with the fact that they had a son together, everything seemed more complicated. He knew part of Emily's resistance came from the fact that she still didn't trust him, and maybe didn't even want to trust him. Could he win that trust back? And more importantly, would it be fair to try? Their past was full of unresolved hurt, and Richard was beginning to realize that perhaps there was more resentment from Emily than he had imagined. He wondered if she would ever forgive him for leaving, for the way things had ended, for the distance he had put between them in the name of ambition. Richard wanted to fix what had been broken, but at the same time, he feared it might be too late. What if he was only causing Emily more pain by trying to reconnect? The truth was, Richard had never been very good at dealing with his emotions. He had spent years suppressing what he felt, focusing on work, on numbers, on goals. It was easier that way. But now, facing this new challenge, he found himself forced to confront what he had long tried to ignore, the loneliness he had felt since leaving Emily and the life in Texas behind, the emptiness he had filled with material success for years. That night, as he stared at the city, trying to calm his mind, Richard remembered an old conversation he'd had with his father, long before everything had changed. His father, a simple man, always said, "No matter how far you go, no success makes up for the lack of love." At the time, Richard didn't understand what that meant. He had been so focused on his career and dreams of greatness that he didn't pay attention to advice about family or feelings. But now, those words took on a new meaning. He had reached the top, but he was alone and empty. A part of Richard wanted to back away, to give up. Maybe it would be better to let Emily and Jake live their lives without his interference. They were surviving despite the difficulties. Jake seemed to be a resilient kid, and Emily had built a life for the two of them. The fear of making things worse was strong. Maybe the best he could do was stay at a distance, helping financially without getting emotionally involved. But would that be enough? This internal battle between retreating or moving forward was eating away at Richard. He knew that the decision he made in the coming days would affect not only his life, but Jake's and Emily's as well, and that paralyzed him. He had always been the kind of man who knew what to do, but now for the first time, he felt incapable of making a clear decision. As the days passed, Richard's internal discomfort only grew. At work, he was distant, almost unmotivated, something unusual for someone who had always been so involved in his company. Evelyn noticed the changes but said nothing, simply maintaining her attentive and caring demeanor. She knew her boss was going through a personal crisis and that rushing him with words wouldn't resolve anything. As Richard struggled to decide his next step, he began to realize that part of his conflict came from the fear of letting go of who he had become. To be a father, he would have to become a different person, a man less centered on success and more dedicated to affection, to constant presence, and that change was terrifying. He had molded himself to be what he was, strong, cold, focused, and now he needed to dismantle all of that to become vulnerable. That same week, Richard made a decision, albeit a hesitant one. He needed to try. He couldn't continue with the doubt of not knowing if he could reconnect with Jake, and above all, he couldn't distance himself from Emily, even though their past was complicated. But to move forward, he would have to prepare to face his biggest fears. The fear of being rejected, the fear of failing as a father, and most of all, the fear of getting emotionally involved in a way he wasn't sure he could sustain. That night he picked up the phone, his fingers trembling slightly, and called Emily. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. Her voice was cold but polite. "Richard?" Emily said, surprised that he had called. He took a deep breath, gathering the courage that seemed to escape his lungs. "Emily, we need to talk. I need you to give me a chance, not just to talk, but to be present. I want to do this the right way, and I know I can't change the past, but I want to be here. For Jake. For you." The words came out more sincere than he had imagined, and Richard felt a vulnerability he hadn't experienced in a long time. On the other end of the line, Emily was silent for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Richard knew she was weighing whether he truly deserved this chance. Finally, she replied, her voice still full of uncertainty but with a slight openness. "We can talk, Richard, but it's not going to be easy. You know that, right?" Richard nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know, but I'm willing to try," he replied, with more conviction than he felt deep down. Richard's internal battle wasn't over yet, but he was ready to face it head-on. He knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, and the next conversation with Emily could be decisive for his and Jake's future. But above all, he was starting to accept that he couldn't control everything. And sometimes the greatest act of strength is learning to let go. Richard arrived at the small cafe in Brooklyn where he had arranged to meet Emily. The place was modest, cozy, with wooden tables and simple decor, a stark contrast to the luxurious environments he was used to. The smell of fresh coffee and the low hum of conversations around them created a pleasant atmosphere, but the tension surrounding Richard kept him from relaxing. He arrived early. He needed a few minutes to mentally prepare before Emily appeared. "It's now or never," he thought, as he tried to organize his thoughts. Evelyn's words had been his anchor in recent days, and her advice echoed in his mind. Show her you're committed, that you genuinely want to be part of their lives. He knew this was the moment to put that into practice. Minutes later, Emily walked into the cafe. She wore a long coat, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Her eyes immediately found Richard's, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. He stood up, trying to hide his anxiety, and she approached with a cautious expression. "Hi, Richard," Emily said, her voice reserved but calm. She seemed prepared for anything he might say, as if she had rehearsed responses to everything. "Emily," he replied, nodding. "Thanks for coming." The two sat down, and the initial silence was heavy, filled with everything that hadn't been said in the past years. Richard was used to negotiating big deals, but at that moment, he felt more nervous than ever. What was at stake wasn't money, but something far more important, the chance to have a life with Jake and perhaps rebuild something with Emily. "I've thought a lot about what we talked about," Richard began, breaking the silence. "I know all of this was a shock, and I understand why you made the decisions you did in the past, but I don't want to be distant anymore." He paused, trying to choose his words carefully. "I know I made mistakes, a lot of mistakes, but I want to be present in Jake's life, and of course in yours too, if you'll let me." Emily sighed, her gaze fixed on his. She wanted to believe his words, but the scars from the past were still very present. Her life had been shaped by the choices she made to protect Jake. And the last thing she wanted was for Richard to suddenly enter and destabilize everything. "I understand what you're saying, Richard," Emily said with forced calmness, "but you need to understand that this won't be easy. Jake, he doesn't know who you are. He's spent his whole life without a father, and I don't know how he's going to react to this." She looked out the window, as if trying to find the right words. "And I don't know if I trust you enough to let you in for real. I've spent a long time protecting Jake from all of this, and what I fear most is that if you get close to him and then give up, it's going to hurt him deeply." Emily's honesty pierced Richard like a knife. He knew he deserved that distrust. He had left her life without looking back, and now he expected to be accepted without reservations. The reality was more complicated than any negotiation or strategy he had ever faced. "I understand what you're saying, and I don't expect this to happen overnight," Richard admitted, his voice softer now, "but I want to prove that I'm here to stay. I don't want to just throw money at the situation or make promises I can't keep. I want to be genuinely present, for Jake, and for you. I know we can't change the past, but we can start building something now." Emily remained silent, pondering. She knew that what Richard was saying sounded sincere, but life had taught her to be cautious, especially when it came to protecting her son. She was about to respond when her phone rang, vibrating on the table. She glanced at the unknown number on the screen, frowned, and answered. "Hello?" Emily said, while Richard watched her with curiosity. Emily's expression quickly shifted from cautious to alarmed. Her face hardened, and she abruptly stood, gripping the phone tightly. "What? When did this happen?" she asked, her voice tense. "Is he okay?" "I'm coming now." Emily hung up the phone and looked at Richard, panic evident on her face. "Jake, he's in the hospital." The words came out almost as a whisper, but the impact was immediate. Richard stood up instantly, his heart racing. "What? What happened?" Emily shook her head, clearly disoriented. "I don't know exactly. He was coming back from school and collapsed on the street. A driver found him and took him to the hospital." Her voice broke as she tried to keep her composure, but the fear was clear. Without a second thought, Richard grabbed his coat and followed Emily out of the cafe. They rushed to Richard's car, the tension between them transforming into pure urgency. The silence during the short drive to the hospital was heavy, both of them lost in their own thoughts and worries. The fear of losing Jake, the son Richard had only just begun to know, and the boy Emily had spent her life protecting, hung over them. When they arrived at the hospital, Emily ran to the reception desk, frantically seeking information about where Jake was being treated. Richard followed closely, his heart tight with anxiety. Soon, they were directed to the pediatric emergency ward. Emily practically burst into the waiting room, her eyes desperately searching for any information. A nurse approached. "Carter?" she asked. Emily nodded, breathless. "Your son is being treated by the doctors now. He collapsed on the street, but his vital signs are stable. We need to wait for the test results. But he's under observation." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back both relief and fear. Richard, standing beside her, felt a knot in his stomach. He was so close to Jake, yet still so far. The fear of losing a son he barely knew paralyzed him, and the regret over all the time he had lost began to weigh on him. "Can I see him?" Emily asked anxiously, her voice trembling. "Not yet," the nurse replied gently. "But as soon as the doctors finish their exams, you'll be able to." Time seemed to crawl. Time. The clock on the wall moved slowly, and every minute felt like an eternity for Emily and Richard, sitting in the waiting room, both lost in their own thoughts. Emily trembled slightly, and without thinking, Richard placed his hand on hers, offering support. Surprisingly, she didn't pull away, accepting the comfort he provided. After what felt like an endless wait, the doctor finally appeared, and Emily immediately stood. "Is Jake okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. The doctor smiled slightly, trying to calm them. "He's stable. The tests show it was just a fainting episode caused by exhaustion and dehydration. Nothing serious, but he'll need rest and follow-up care to make sure this doesn't happen again." Relief washed over Emily like a wave, and Richard felt the weight lift from his shoulders as well. They could finally see him. When they entered Jake's room, the boy was lying down, still pale but with his eyes open. When he saw his mother, he managed a weak smile. "Mom," he said softly. Emily rushed to him, gently caressing his face. "I'm here, sweetheart," she said, tears finally falling. Richard stood at the door, watching the scene. He wanted to approach, to say something, but he felt it wasn't the right moment. Jake glanced at him, confused about who he was and why he was there, but he was too tired to ask. The doctor entered the room again, adjusting some equipment before addressing Emily. "Did you know that Jake has been feeling overwhelmed lately?" He mentioned being tired and sometimes missing proper meals during the day. That could have contributed to the fainting spell. It's important to ensure he's well nourished and getting enough rest, the doctor explained. His words hit Emily like a blow. She knew Jake had been trying to help with the family's finances by selling things on the streets, but she never imagined it was affecting his health. She looked at Jake, feeling a mix of guilt and pain. Richard, standing on the other side of the room, observed everything in silence, feeling a new wave of responsibility washing over him. He knew he had to step up. The hours in the hospital passed slowly. Emily sat by Jake's bedside, holding his hand as the boy rested. The exhaustion Jake had been hiding finally caught up with him, and the guilt coursed through Emily like poison. She should have seen the signs earlier. She knew life in the Bronx was hard, and Jake, always so proud and determined, had been doing everything he could not to worry her. But now she saw how much he had been sacrificing. It had been difficult balancing her job at the restaurant and raising Jake on her own. But letting him work on the streets, even though she hadn't realized how much it was hurting his health, made her feel like an absent mother. Richard remained quiet in the corner of the room, watching everything, his heart heavy. Seeing Jake like this, vulnerable, filled him with regret. He should have been there to prevent this. He should have provided a better life for his son. Jake shouldn't have to sell flowers at stoplights to help pay the bills. A 10-year-old boy should be playing, studying, living a carefree childhood. The tension between Richard and Emily only grew as time passed. Though both were focused on Jake, the silence between them was thick, full of unspoken words. The hospital, with its white lights and sterile smell, intensified their emotions, as if the confined space around them amplified everything that was trapped in their hearts. When Jake finally fell asleep, Emily got up from the chair beside his bed and quietly left the room. Richard instinctively followed her. Once they were outside in the hospital corridor, Emily stopped and turned to face him, her face tired but her expression firm. "This can't go on like this, Richard," she said, her voice low but steady. "I can't let Jake live through this emotional roller coaster. He almost collapsed from exhaustion, and now you show up wanting to be part of his life. But you can't just come and go like it's that simple. I need to know what your real intention is." Richard took a deep breath, preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming. Emily's gaze was a mixture of anger and worry, and he understood why. "I want to be part of his life, Emily. For real. I'm not going to disappear again," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "But I know I messed up. I know I was never there for you both, and that destroys me inside. But I won't let it happen again." Emily shook her head, her eyes brimming with frustration and fear. "You say that now, Richard, but what happens when work pulls you away again? When your life in Manhattan, with all its luxuries and responsibilities, demands more of you? Will you be able to keep that promise?" Her voice faltered slightly, and she closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back tears. Richard felt the sting of those words. Emily knew him well, knew the kind of life he lived. She had every reason to doubt him. "I'm not the same man I was when I left," Richard said, trying to find the right words. "I can't change the past, but I can make sure that from now on things are different. I want to give Jake a better life. I want to be present, not just with money, but with real time, with real presence." Emily opened her eyes, staring at Richard. She wanted to believe him, but the fear that he might fail again paralyzed her. "Jake doesn't need money, Richard. He needs stability. He needs someone he can count on, someone who won't leave when things get tough." The pain in her voice was evident, and Richard knew she was speaking as much for herself as she was for Jake. "I've spent years trying to give him that stability. He's learned not to depend on anyone but me." Richard nodded, accepting the weight of the truth Emily carried. Jake had grown up without him, and trusting someone who had never been there would be hard for the boy. "I understand," Richard said quietly, fighting the feeling of helplessness. "I know I have to prove that. I want the chance to do that, not to fix what I did, but to be here for him, and for you." Emily looked away, trying to process everything. She knew she was at a crossroads. She knew Richard was being sincere, but fear still spoke louder. What if he was wrong? What if by letting Richard get close to Jake, she was opening the door to more pain? Before she could respond, Richard's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and saw it was an important work call, probably something urgent. The dilemma hit him hard. He knew the deal in progress required his immediate attention, but right here, right now, with Emily and Jake needing him, what really mattered? Emily noticed the hesitation on his face and frowned. "Are you going to answer that?" she asked, her voice cold. Richard stared at the phone for a few seconds, the sound of it vibrating filling the space between them. It was a symbolic choice, and he knew it. If he answered, it would confirm all of Emily's fears about him. If he didn't, he could lose an important deal. But at that moment, he realized there was something much more important at stake. With a decisive motion, he silenced the phone and put it back in his pocket, not breaking eye contact with Emily. "This can wait," he said firmly. Emily didn't say anything, but the fact that he made that choice didn't go unnoticed. Still, she wasn't ready to give in. Words wouldn't be enough. Richard would need to prove, with actions, that he was willing to change his priorities. Turning off the phone was a start, but the road ahead would still be long and difficult. The silence between them was interrupted when the nurse came out of Jake's room and called them. "He's awake and asking for you," the nurse said with a gentle smile. Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward, but before entering the room, she turned to Richard. "Let's see how he's doing now. But this doesn't change the fact that you'll have to prove you really want to be part of his life." There was a hardness in her voice, but also a slight opening. She wasn't completely closed to the idea that Richard could change, but he would have to show much more than empty promises. Richard nodded, understanding what was being demanded of him. "I know, Emily, and I'll prove it," he said, with a firmness he hadn't felt before. They entered Jake's room together. The boy was awake, still weak, but smiling when he saw his mother. Richard stood by, watching, unsure of how to interact. Jake looked at him, curious, then turned to his mother. "Who's he, Mom?" Jake asked, his voice low but clear. Richard's heart stopped for a second. This was it. The moment of truth. Emily looked at Richard, hesitating, clearly unsure of what to say. The words were caught in her throat. Emily began, her voice faltering slightly. She moved closer to Jake, sitting by his bed, and held his hand. "Jake, this is Richard. The words seemed to escape her, but she knew she couldn't delay it any longer. "He's your father." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake looked at Richard, confusion and shock written on his face. Richard tried to smile, but his uncertainty showed. "My father?" Jake asked, as if trying to process what he had just heard. The boy frowned, clearly shaken by the sudden revelation. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Emily felt the weight of Jake's question hit her like a punch. How could she explain everything to her son in a way he would understand? Richard, meanwhile, stood frozen, knowing that the moment he had feared had arrived. Jake's gaze shifted between the two adults, searching for answers to questions he never knew he needed to ask. "We'll talk about it, Jake," Emily said, trying to stay calm. "But right now, what matters is that you're okay. We can talk more about this later, when you feel better." Jake seemed unsatisfied but nodded, still processing what he had just learned. Richard knew that the real conversation was yet to come, but for now, the focus had to be on Jake's recovery. The silence that filled the hospital room after the revelation that Richard was Jake's father was thick, almost suffocating. Jake, lying in bed, looked from one to the other, trying to process everything he had just heard. Emily remained by his side, her hand resting on his, trying to offer some comfort, though she herself was shaken. Richard, on the other hand, seemed paralyzed. The truth he had so longed to reveal was now out in the open, but the weight of Jake's reaction was far greater than he had anticipated. Jake was still trying to understand what it meant to have a father, someone he had never known, someone who was only now appearing in his life. The boy, usually full of energy and resilience, seemed to crumble under the confusion and shock. You're my father?" Jake repeated, his voice low and trembling. His eyes were still fixed on Richard, searching for answers neither adult seemed ready to give. Richard took a step forward, wanting to say something to ease the tension, but the words failed him. The boy was clearly lost, and Richard realized that, as much as he wanted to fix the past, it might be too late to build the trust that had never existed. Emily, sensing Jake's distress, tried to calm the situation. "Jake, I know this is a lot to process right now, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you before. I just wanted to protect you, to do what was right." Jake, however, interrupted his mother, his voice suddenly rising, filled with emotions he could no longer contain. "Protect me from what?" He lifted his head from the pillow, looking directly at Emily, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "You kept him from me. I could have had a father this whole time?" Emily froze, the pain of her son's words hitting hard. She knew he would have many questions, knew this moment would be difficult, but nothing had prepared her for the look of hurt on Jake's face. "I thought I was doing what was best for you," Emily said, her voice breaking as she tried to hold back tears. "I was scared of how it would affect you, scared that Richard might not be ready." "But I had the right to know," Jake shouted, and the tears finally spilled down his cheeks. He turned his head, glaring at Richard with a mix of anger and pain. "And you? Why didn't you ever come to see me? Where were you?" What were you doing this whole time?" His voice was full of accusations, and each word cut through Richard like a knife. Richard took another step toward the bed, his face pale, clearly shaken. He opened his mouth to respond, but all he could manage was, "I didn't know, Jake. I didn't know you existed." "Didn't know?" Jake spat back, disbelief evident. "How could you not know? Don't you care about us?" Richard felt the ground open beneath him. All his attempts to right the past seemed futile in the face of Jake's pain. He had never felt so powerless, so incapable of finding the right words. And then, in a sudden movement, Jake pulled his hand away from Emily's, turning his face to the other side of the bed, refusing to look at either of them. "Get out," he muttered, his voice broken. "I don't want to talk to either of you." Emily, devastated, tried to move closer, but Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. She looked at him, confused, but Richard just shook his head. He knew Jake needed space. Forcing a conversation now would only hurt him more. "Let's give him some time," Richard said, his voice low, filled with pain. Emily hesitated, but agreed. She knew Jake was hurting, but there was nothing more to say at that moment. They both left the hospital room in silence, stepping into the hallway. As soon as the door closed, Emily broke down. She leaned against the wall and covered her face with her hands, letting the tears she had held back for so long finally fall. The guilt was eating her alive. She had made all the decisions by herself, trying to protect Jake, but now it seemed like everything she had done only caused more pain. Richard stood beside her, unsure of what to say. Seeing Emily so devastated, so vulnerable, made the weight of his own choices press down even harder on him. He hadn't been there when Jake needed him most, and now he was facing the consequences of that. Everything felt like it was falling apart. All his efforts to reconnect with his son were crumbling, and he didn't know how to fix it. I don't know what to do," Emily sobbed, her hands still covering her face. "I just wanted to protect him. I just wanted him to be happy." Without thinking, Richard moved closer and pulled Emily into an embrace. For the first time in years, he held her, not as the strong, determined businessman, but as someone just as lost as she was. He said nothing. There were no words that could fix what had happened. Emily, surprised by the gesture, stood still for a moment but soon broke down in his arms, allowing herself to cry. She knew she couldn't keep trying to carry the weight of all the decisions alone. She wasn't alone in this journey anymore. Richard was there, and as much as the distrust still lingered, a part of her knew that he truly wanted to make things work. But would that be enough? The silence between them this time wasn't filled with tension, but with understanding. Both were hurting, and both knew they stood at the edge of a deep chasm. Jake's wounds ran deep, and earning his trust wouldn't be easy. They might never fully repair the damage. "He hates us," Emily whispered through her tears. "He's hurt," Richard corrected softly. "But he doesn't hate us, Emily. This is going to take time, more time than I expected, more than either of us expected, but I'm not giving up. He needs us, even if he doesn't see that right now." Emily finally pulled away from the embrace, quickly wiping her eyes. She looked at Richard, trying to find a strength within herself that seemed to have vanished. Jake needed stability, needed a life without so many emotional upheavals, and that meant Richard would have to be present. She knew that. But at the same time, she still feared he wasn't ready for the responsibilities that came with that. "You say that now, but what if things get harder?" Emily asked, her voice still shaky. "What if he keeps rejecting you?" I can't go through this again, Richard. I can't watch Jake suffer more than he already has." Richard nodded, understanding the depth of Emily's concern. He knew it would be a difficult journey, full of emotional obstacles, but something inside him, something he had never felt before, was driving him to keep going. "I know it's going to be hard, but I'm here to stay," Richard said, with more conviction than ever before. "I'm not leaving Jake or you. We'll get through this somehow." Emily looked at him for a long moment, searching for any signs of hesitation or doubt, but for the first time she saw none. Maybe, just maybe, Richard was truly ready to be part of their lives. But even so, she knew the road ahead would be tough. As the hours at the hospital dragged on, Richard and Emily decided not to pressure Jake with more conversations. They respected the boy's wish to be alone, knowing he needed time to process the truth. When they left the hospital that night, the air was heavy, and both knew that the emotional collapse they had just faced was only the beginning of a long healing process. The morning after Jake's collapse felt quieter, but the weight of the previous day's events still hung over them all. The hospital, with its cold, bright atmosphere, seemed to reflect the confused and wounded hearts of Richard, Emily, and Jake. Though physically recovered, Jake's emotional wounds were much deeper and harder to heal. Jake, still lying in bed, stared out the window, distant. The revelation that Richard was his father left him feeling lost. For 10 years, he had believed it was just him and his mother against the world. Now, suddenly, there was a father in the picture. Someone he didn't know. Someone who wasn't there when he needed him most. Anger and confusion warred within him, and he didn't know how to process it all. He was angry at his mother for keeping this secret, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore her constant presence in his life. And Richard? He didn't know what to feel about the man who had abandoned him without even knowing he existed. Richard and Emily had returned to the hospital that morning, but both hesitated before entering Jake's room. The emotions from the day before were still too raw. Emily held her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly, while Richard paced back and forth in the hallway as if trying to find the right words he knew might never come. "He's still angry with us, isn't he?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. She looked at Richard, searching for some comfort, but his eyes were filled with uncertainty. "Yeah, he is," Richard replied, trying to accept the truth they both knew. "But we can't give up on him, Emily. We can't let him push us away now." Emily sighed. She wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that they could build something with Jake. But deep down, she was afraid. Jake's anger was understandable, but she knew there was a long road ahead, and she wasn't sure they had the strength to keep going. "What if he never forgives us?" Emily asked softly, her voice filled with fear and vulnerability. Richard stopped and looked at her, realizing just how fragile Emily was too. He stepped closer and took her hand, squeezing it gently. For the first time, they were truly in this battle together, facing the same fear. "Maybe he won't forgive us right away," Richard said, his voice steady but calm. "But forgiveness isn't going to come quickly. It'll take time, and we're going to have to earn it, from him and from ourselves." He looked into her eyes, and for a moment, something deeper passed between them. A mutual understanding, a silent pact that they would need to lean on each other to face what lay ahead. Emily nodded, still uncertain, but feeling a flicker of hope. They weren't alone. For the first time in many years, she had Richard by her side, and as much as the distrust still lingered, she knew she needed to believe that things could get better. They had to get better. For Jake. They entered the room together, trying not to show the nervousness they felt. Jake was awake but made no eye contact with either of them. He continued staring out the window, his small fingers absent-mindedly playing with the bedsheet. The tension in the air was palpable, but they both knew they had to face it. Emily was the first to speak. "Jake, how are you feeling?" she asked softly, approaching the bed. She wanted to hug him, to comfort him, but she knew her son was still too hurt to accept any gesture of affection. "Fine," was Jake's only response, short and emotionless. Richard stepped forward, feeling the need to say something, even knowing that anything he said might be met with coldness. "Jake, I know you're confused and angry, and you have every right to feel that way," he began, his voice low but sincere. "I just want you to know that I'm not here to force anything. I don't expect you to accept me right away, and I understand if you don't want to talk to me right now. But I want to be here. I want to be someone you can trust, in time." Jake remained silent, still staring out the window. He wasn't ready to accept Richard's words. The pain of knowing his father had been absent his whole life was too deep to resolve with a single conversation. And the anger he felt toward his mother was still boiling inside him, a mix of betrayal and confusion. The silence stretched for a few more minutes until Emily, sensing that they might be pushing too hard, suggested, "Jake, I'll go get you something to eat, okay? I'll be right back." She gave Richard a final look, signaling that he should stay and try to talk more with Jake. Richard understood the message and stayed behind, standing alone in the room with the son he so desperately wanted to know. There was a long silence before Richard decided to try again. "Jake, I know you don't want to talk right now," Richard said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But when you're ready, I'll be here. Always. I'm not going anywhere this time." Jake finally turned to face him, his dark eyes filled with hurt. "You talk like it's easy," Jake said, his voice hard. "Like I can just forgive you for not being there. Like that would fix everything." He paused, clearly trying to control the emotions surging inside him. "Where were you? When I needed a dad? When I was alone? When Mom was too tired to do everything by herself? You show up now, after everything, and you think I'm just going to accept you?" Jake's words cut deep. Richard felt the pain of those truths, the absence he could never make up for. "No, Jake," Richard said, his voice heavy. "I don't expect you to forgive me just like that, and I know I can't change what happened. But I'm here now, and I'm going to fight to be in your life. to be the father you deserve. I know it'll take time, but I'm ready to wait." Jake shook his head, frustrated. "You don't get it," he said, turning his face back to the window. "You'll never understand." The silence in the room returned, oppressive and thick. Richard felt defeated. All he wanted was to fix things, but it was clear it wouldn't be that simple. Jake was hurt, and that wound would take a long time to heal, if it ever did. When Emily returned with the food, the tension in the room remained heavy. She could sense how distant Jake was, how Richard's words, sincere as they were, weren't making a difference. She knew this process would be long, and that left her emotionally exhausted. But she also knew giving up wasn't an option. In the days following Jake's release from the hospital, Richard stayed close, careful not to invade the boy's space. He offered help with small things, picking Jake up from school, driving Emily to work when she needed a ride, and even helping financially with the bills that had piled up. But most importantly, he was present, something he had never offered before. He knew he couldn't force a relationship with Jake, but he hoped the boy would eventually see that he was here to stay. Emily, on the other hand, was trying to deal with her own emotions. Seeing Richard so present, so willing to change, made her believe there might be hope, but the fear that he might fail again still lingered constantly. She knew only time would tell if he was truly committed. Jake, however, continued to reject Richard's attempts at closeness. He shut himself off even more, sinking into silence. Sometimes he would spend hours drawing or playing video games, avoiding any serious conversations with either of them. Emily knew this phase was normal, but she feared that the emotional barrier between Jake and Richard was unbreakable. It was only a few weeks later, on a quiet afternoon, when Jake silently asked Richard to take him to the park. Richard almost couldn't believe it when he heard the request, but he stayed calm, trying not to show how much it meant to him. At the park, they walked in silence for a while until Jake suddenly asked, "Are you going to leave again?" Richard stopped walking and looked at his son, realizing the fear behind that question. Jake didn't want to open up because he was afraid that if he did, he would lose Richard again. He feared trusting someone who might leave just like before. "No," Richard replied, his voice firm. "I'm not going anywhere, Jake. I promise." Jake didn't respond, but he nodded slightly, as if processing the words. It was a small step, but for Richard, it was a huge leap. The weeks following the hospital incident brought small progress, but also many difficulties. Jake remained distant, still processing the truth about Richard and what it meant for his life. Emily, meanwhile, tried to balance her work life with taking care of Jake, while also learning to adjust to Richard's constant presence. It was as if a new balance was slowly being built, but the foundation was fragile, ready to crumble at the slightest sign of tension. Richard, despite all his efforts to be patient and present, still felt the sting of Jake's rejection. He was doing everything he could, being more involved than ever, offering help at every opportunity, trying to give Jake the space he needed. But still, the boy couldn't fully trust him, and deep down, Richard knew the blame was his. He had missed the most important moments of Jake's life, and now he was paying the price. Everything came to a head on a Saturday afternoon, when Emily suggested they spend the day together at the park as a way to try to bring Jake and Richard closer. She knew it would be difficult, but she believed that with time, Jake might start to see Richard's efforts differently. It was an attempt to rebuild what time had destroyed. The day was sunny, and the park was full of families, children running and playing, and couples having picnics. Richard and Emily walked side by side, while Jake, keeping his distance, kicked a ball around with little enthusiasm. The atmosphere between them was tense, but no one dared to break the silence. Trying to create a connection, Richard offered to play with Jake. "How about a little soccer match, Jake?" he suggested, forcing a smile. "I'm not that good, but I bet you're great." Jake looked at Richard for a moment, with a mix of distrust and the lingering pain he carried. He picked up the ball and, without answering, kicked it hard toward Richard. Caught off guard, Richard stumbled trying to catch the ball and fell to the ground, drawing laughter from some nearby children. He quickly got up, trying to keep the mood light, but it was clear something deeper was going on. Jake crossed his arms, glaring at Richard with a harsh expression. "Is that all you are?" he asked, his voice filled with resentment. "You think showing up and playing soccer will change anything? Will make me accept you as my dad?" Those words hit Richard like a punch. He knew he was trying, but Jake's truth pierced through his emotional armor. What more could he do to prove he wanted to be there? The silence between them became unbearable, and Emily, sensing how out of control things were getting, tried to intervene. "Jake, that's not fair," she said softly, trying to calm the situation. "Richard is here. He's trying..." But Jake cut her off, the anger finally spilling over. "Trying to do what, Mom? Fix things? Where was he when I needed a dad? Where was he when you were alone? He was never here, and now he thinks he can just walk into my life like nothing happened. Emily stepped back, feeling the weight of Jake's words. She knew her son was hurt, but she hadn't realized just how deep that wound ran until now. Richard, standing there, stared at his son with a mix of pain and helplessness. "I know I wasn't here, Jake," Richard said, his voice low, trying to control the emotion rising in his chest. "I know I messed up. I'm not going to try and justify that. There's no excuse for what happened, and I don't expect you to forgive me easily." Jake shook his head, his eyes filling with tears he was struggling to hold back. He wanted to stay strong, to hold on to the anger, but the confusion and sadness were starting to overwhelm him. "Then why are you here now?" Jake almost shouted. "Why can't you just go away? I don't need you." The words were like knives, cutting deep into Richard's heart. This was his biggest fear, being rejected by his own son. He knew the process would be painful, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of those words. For a moment, Richard thought about retreating, about giving up. Maybe that's what Jake really wanted. Maybe his presence was only causing more pain. But then he remembered the promise he had made, to himself and to Jake. He wasn't going to give up. Not this time. "I'm not going anywhere, Jake," Richard said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "No matter what you say, no matter how hard it gets. I know I'm late, and I know I can't erase what happened. But I'm here now, and I'm going to stay, even if you don't want me to, because you're my son, and I love you." Jake looked at Richard, surprised by the declaration. He hadn't expected to hear that, hadn't expected to feel the honesty behind the words. He had carried so much anger and resentment that he never thought there could be room for something different. But now, seeing his father, the man he had learned to hate for not being there, speak with such sincerity, something inside him began to crack. The silence that followed was heavy, but meaningful. Jake took a deep breath, trying to hold back his tears, but failing. He looked at the ground, unsure of what to say or how to process everything he was feeling. The anger, the sadness, the hurt, all mixed together, confusing his thoughts. Emily, watching the scene unfold, felt a wave of emotion surge through her body. She knew this was the turning point. Jake was vulnerable, and Richard had done the one thing she hadn't expected. He had shown vulnerability too. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake lifted his eyes again, now filled with tears. He looked at Richard, his voice trembling, but there was something new in it, something he was just beginning to understand. "Do you really love me?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible, as if he still wasn't sure. Richard stepped forward, feeling a deep pain but also a new sense of hope forming. "Yes, Jake, I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you if I have to." Jake didn't say anything else. He took a step toward Richard, then another, and in a sudden movement, he threw himself into his father's arms. The tears finally fell, and he cried, letting all the emotions he had held back for so long flow. He cried for all the times he felt the absence of a father, for all the times he watched his mother struggle alone, for all the emptiness he never knew how to fill. Richard held him tightly, tears streaming down his own face as well. He knew this wasn't complete forgiveness, that there was still a lot of work to do, but it was a beginning. It was the first time Jake had allowed him to truly be present. Emily, watching the scene with tears in her eyes, felt something break inside her too. That moment was healing for all of them. It wasn't the end of their challenges, but it was a step toward recovery. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could become a family again. The days following the encounter at the park brought a new atmosphere to Richard, Emily, and Jake. There were still scars, still lingering hurts, but something had shifted in that moment when Jake finally allowed Richard into his life, albeit cautiously. The healing process was just beginning, and they all knew it wouldn't be simple. But for the first time, there was hope, a light at the end of the tunnel. Richard, now more determined than ever, made sure to be present. He didn't pull away, not even for a moment. And over time, Jake began to see that his father was really trying. It wasn't easy for either of them. Jake still harbored resentment, and Richard still carried the guilt of years of absence. But little by little, they were learning to understand each other. Emily watched this slow transformation with a mix of relief and concern. She was happy that Jake was gradually opening up to Richard, but she feared something could still go wrong. Life had taught her that trusting blindly was risky. Yet seeing Richard's genuine effort to reconnect with Jake made her believe that maybe things could truly get better. One afternoon, a few weeks after the park episode, Richard decided to do something he had never done before: take Jake to his office. He wanted to show his son an important part of his life, not because he thought Jake should be interested in business, but because he wanted him to see every facet of who he was. It was a way to open up a new space between them, a space where they could share experiences, even if in different ways. "How about coming with me to the office today?" Richard asked as they had breakfast together at Emily's house. "You don't have to do anything, just come along. You can see what my day-to-day is like." Jake, focused on his bowl of cereal, looked at Richard curiously. "Office?" Jake asked with a small, curious smile. "What's so interesting about that?" Richard smiled back, feeling like this was an opportunity to get closer. "Well, believe me, it's probably not as fun as it sounds," he laughed. "But it's where I spend most of my time, and I think it'd be cool for you to see how it works." Jake hesitated for a moment. He was still getting used to Richard's presence in his life, and the idea of stepping into his father's world felt strange. But it also sparked his curiosity. "Okay," he finally replied, shrugging slightly. "I'll go." The relief Richard felt was almost palpable. He knew these small moments were crucial for building trust between them. When they arrived at Richard's company building, Jake was impressed by the size and bustle of the place. People were moving everywhere. The environment was sleek, and Richard was greeted with polite smiles. Everything felt grand and far removed from the world Jake knew. But at the same time, there was something comforting about seeing Richard's human side there. He wasn't just the absent father, but a man who, despite everything, wanted to be part of his life. Inside the office, Richard showed Jake the basics of how things worked. From meetings to the important decisions he made daily, Jake observed everything with growing curiosity. Although he didn't understand much about the business world, it was the first time he was seeing his father in his own element, which made him feel like he was discovering a significant part of the man he hardly knew. After a few hours, Richard took a break from his activities to focus entirely on his son. "So, what do you think?" he asked with a light smile, though clearly anxious for the response. Jake shrugged again, but there was a spark in his eyes. "It's cool, I guess. I never imagined it was like that." He paused before continuing. "You work a lot, huh?" Richard chuckled softly, feeling a sense of lightness seeing Jake interact with him more naturally. "I do. A lot." He looked at his son with a more serious gaze. "But that's going to change. I'm going to work less, to spend more time with you and your mom. That's important to me now." Jake was silent for a moment, taking in what Richard said. He wasn't entirely ready to believe his father's promises, but for the first time, he was willing to give him a chance. "That'd be nice," Jake said, looking at Richard. It was the acceptance Richard had been hoping for. The days continued, and the relationship between them began to flourish. The emotional barriers Jake had built were slowly breaking down. They started spending more time together, doing simple things, playing video games, going to the movies, or just talking about school and Jake's interests. What had once been a tense and uncertain relationship was now transforming, with Jake beginning to trust his father more, though still cautiously. Emily, watching this growing bond, felt a mix of relief and joy. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but seeing Jake and Richard begin to understand each other was more than she could have hoped for. She too slowly began to let go of her doubts. The Richard who was now part of their lives was not the same man from years ago. He was truly committed, and for the first time in a long while, Emily allowed herself to believe they could be a family. A few weeks later, while the three of them were having dinner together, Jake, with his usual shyness, looked at Richard and asked a question that caught everyone by surprise. "Are you going to stay with us forever?" Jake asked, his eyes locked on Richard's, as if the answer was the most important thing he would ever hear. Richard paused for a second, feeling the weight of the question. He knew that for Jake, the idea of forever was more than just a casual promise. It was the confirmation that he wouldn't abandon them again. It was the security Jake had always wanted but never had. "I'm staying," Richard replied, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm staying with you no matter what happens. We're a family now, Jake. That's not going to change." Emily smiled softly, her heart warmed by seeing Richard keep his word. She remembered how it all began, with fear and uncertainty guiding her decisions. But now she allowed herself to believe in the future. Jake simply nodded, satisfied with the answer. For him, that was all he needed to hear. The months that followed brought a new reality for everyone. Richard began to better balance his work and personal life, dedicating more time to Jake and Emily. The relationship between the three of them strengthened, and although the past was still part of them, the future seemed more promising than ever. Months had passed since that pivotal moment at the park, and the lives of Richard, Emily, and Jake had changed significantly. What had once been a fractured relationship, full of uncertainties and resentment, was now beginning to form into something more solid, something stronger, a real family. Richard, who had once been completely absorbed in his work and career, now found himself prioritizing simple but valuable moments with Jake and Emily. He had learned to balance his life in a way he never thought possible. Not that work wasn't important anymore, but professional success was no longer the only thing defining who he was. He had discovered that being a father and being present in Jake's life was the greatest achievement he could ever have. Now, on Saturday mornings, instead of business meetings, Richard was at a soccer field in the park, proudly watching as Jake ran across the grass, playing with other boys his age. He always brought a water bottle for his son, and the two would share light conversations about the games, something that had seemed so distant just months ago. Jake, still shy at times, smiled more easily now, and there was a lightness about him that Richard had never seen before. Emily, on her part, began to feel the peace she had long sought over the years. The constant worry she carried about being solely responsible for everything began to dissipate, and she allowed herself to breathe more freely. Richard was no longer the man who had left years ago. He was now someone she could trust, someone who was there every day, not just for Jake, but for her as well. The conversations between them, once laden with unresolved tensions, were now smoother, filled with shared laughter, old memories revisited, and new plans for the future. One evening, after a long day of work at the restaurant, Emily came home to find Richard and Jake in the kitchen, something that made her smile instantly. They were trying to prepare dinner together, and the mess they had made was obvious. Flour spread across the counter, vegetables chopped unevenly, and a pot that had clearly been. Jake was laughing, and Richard, despite his clumsiness in the kitchen, seemed to be having fun. "I think I'll have to order takeout after this mess," Emily joked, leaning against the kitchen door, watching them with deep affection. Richard looked at her with a sheepish smile. "We were doing fine until the pot started fighting back," he said, as Jake giggled in the background. These simple moments, full of imperfections and laughter, were what Emily had always wanted for her family. They were far from perfect, but it was in the imperfections that she found happiness. It was in Richard's constant presence and Jake's growth that she saw the possibility of a more stable, united future. On a quiet afternoon, sitting in the living room, Emily finally allowed herself to have a conversation she had been putting off for a long time. She knew Richard had been dedicating himself to their new family dynamic, but there was something deeper she needed to say, something that had been weighing on her since the moment he returned to their lives. "I need to say something," Emily began, her voice soft but full of meaning. "When you came back, Richard, I didn't know what to think. I was so scared to let you in again, afraid that things would fall apart like before." She paused, looking at him and then at Jake, who was watching them attentively. "But now I see that you've really changed. You're truly here, and that means everything to me and Jake." Richard, sitting next to her, felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He knew how much those words meant to her, to them. He had fought to earn Emily and Jake's trust, and hearing those words made all the effort worthwhile. "I couldn't have done this without you, Emily," Richard responded, holding her hand. "You gave me a second chance, even when I didn't deserve it. And Jake," he looked at his son, pride in his eyes, "he gave me the chance to be a father, and I'm going to do everything I can to live up to that." Jake, sitting on the floor playing video games, looked at them and smiled. There was a new confidence in his gaze, an understanding that his family was finally coming together, that the uncertainties and hurt were slowly turning into something stronger. He didn't yet fully understand everything about Richard's life, but he trusted now that his father was here to stay. As the days turned into weeks, the new family dynamic grew deeper roots. Jake began to trust Richard more, asking him about life, work, and even seeking advice on school issues. They started developing a father-son relationship that, although delayed, grew with strength. For Jake, Richard's presence was no longer a threat to the stability he and his mother had built, but an addition he began to appreciate. At a Sunday dinner, while they sat together at the small kitchen table, Jake looked at Richard and asked a question that surprised everyone. "Dad, do you think I could maybe work at your company one day?" He seemed shy as he asked, but the curiosity and desire to connect more deeply with his father were evident. Richard, caught off guard by the question, looked at his son with a smile overflowing with pride. "Of course you can, Jake," he replied. "If that's what you want, one day you can work there, learn everything you want. But the most important thing is for you to do what you love, and I'll support you, no matter what." Jake smiled timidly, and Emily, watching the interaction between the two, felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Over time, Richard and Emily also began to explore the possibility of being together again. They still had wounds to heal and decisions to make, but there was a renewed affection and respect between them that drew them closer. There was no rush. They knew that after everything they had been through, the most important thing was honesty and care for each other. The new status quo of their lives was that of a family rebuilding itself, but now with stronger foundations. Richard had found what had been missing in his life. Not business success, but love and presence in Jake and Emily's lives. Emily, for her part, felt lighter, knowing she no longer had to carry the burden alone. And Jake finally was discovering what it meant to have a complete family, something he never knew he could have. At the end of that year, on a cold winter day, the three decided to travel together to Texas, Richard and Emily's hometown. For Jake, it would be his first time visiting the small town where his parents grew up, and for Richard and Emily, it was a symbolic return to the place where it all began. The trip was simple, but meaningful. As they walked through the quiet streets of the countryside, observing memories of the past, they realized how much they had grown, how much their lives had changed. At the top of a hill, as they watched the sunset together, Richard held Emily's hand and wrapped his arm around Jake. Finally, he felt that the emptiness he had carried for so long was filled. It was the beginning of a new story, a story that this time they would write together.